But my op-ed today over at HartmannReport.com is titled, How Can We Stop the Greedheads from Their Destruction of Banking and More? And of course, we're talking about the Silicon Valley Bank failure. President Biden came out this morning and said, we're gonna, well, basically, here's how it works, and then what he said. How it works is the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, the FDIC, guarantees that if you put money in a bank that's FDIC insured, and the Silicon Valley Bank was, in fact, pretty much all banks in the United States are, that if you put money in a bank like that and the bank goes bust, the FDIC will give you up to $250,000, $250,000. So if you're under $250,000, you're everything's copacetic. If your deposits in the bank are over $250,000, as many businesses were, and some individuals as well, obviously, but the big concern here, I think, was a lot of these Silicon Valley companies that were using the bank for payroll and things that had, a lot more than $250,000 in there, and they just wouldn't get anything, right, beyond the $250,000. And so what Biden did is he said, we're going to bend the rules here. We're going to have FDIC, which is funded, by the way, by a fee from the banks. We're going to have the FDIC pay everybody everything. We're going to suspend that $250,000 rule, which, should calm everything down, and probably will, although there's two other banks, Signature Bank and what's the name of the other one? Hang on, just Republic Bank, First Republic Bank, both out of New York. Excuse me, that are having similar problems. So we'll see how this shakes out. But, the bottom line is President Biden said this morning, not a penny of taxpayer money on the line here, which so far is true. The problem is FDIC is a, sort of like Amtrak. It's a corporation, but it is government owned and run and administered. So, if they run out of money bailing out this bank, it's going to be up to you and me to give the FDIC enough money to bail out a few other banks. So, we'll see where this goes. Bank stocks are down this morning. A number of bank stocks, they had to suspend trading on the stock exchanges. I'm frankly not particularly freaked out about this because these are the smaller banks. And the reason why is that after it goes back to 1999. We starting in the 1930s, the week that Franklin Roosevelt was inaugurated as president, the first week of March of 1933, when he was sworn in, they later changed it to January, in part because of this. Every bank in America, or pretty much every bank in America, failed. Most of them had already failed. And if you had put your money in a bank, you lost every single penny of it. And, the reason why my grandmother never trusted banks, right? And so, what came out of that was, a whole series of regulations and principally Glass-Steagall. The Glass-Steagall law was passed, actually it was passed in late 1932. It was passed by the Hoover administration. And, it was tweaked and other things were added to it by FDR. But basically those rules kept banks solid and stable all the way through the Reagan administration. And then Reagan came along and said, we hate regulations. We're Republicans. And so he said, let's try out, instead of just deregulating all the banks, let's start with the savings and loans, because they're, a fraction of the size of all the big banks. And so they deregulated the savings and loans in 1983. And sure enough, 5 years later, 1987, over 1,000 of them went bankrupt as their CEOs and members of their boards of directors walked off with multi-million-dollar bonuses and all this kind of thing. So that didn't work out so well, so they re-regulated the S&Ls. That was in the 80s. Then comes 1999, and Texas Republican Senator Phil Gramm comes out and says, this Glass-Steagall thing from 1932 has worked so well all these years. It's prevented any bank failures. Obviously, we don't need it anymore. And so they did it away with it in 1999. And that, of course, caused the banks to start, gambling with our checkbook savings and, buying risky mortgages and tranches of mortgages. And you know the whole story, right? We all lived through it. And that led directly to the Bush crash of 2008, where the whole system froze up, and you and I and the FDIC and the Fed poured literally trillions of dollars into the pockets of these big banks in New York, and the banksters themselves, who took billion-dollar bonuses out of this multi-trillion-dollar, it was like a $12 trillion bailout. The banksters got rich on that. So in response to that 2008 disaster, in 2010, President Obama signed into law legislation that re-regulated the banks. It wasn't Glass-Steagall. It didn't go as far as separating commercial banks from investment banks, which is what Glass-Steagall had done, but it was a good step. So then comes Donald Trump in 2018 with the Republicans controlling Congress, and they said, this is fine regulating the big banks, but these medium-sized banks, these banks that are, have a $250 million or less in assets, $250 million or less, we don't really need to regulate them. They're fine. They're not the ones that crashed the economy. That was the big banks. And so President Trump very proudly signed into law deregulation of these medium-sized and small banks, like Silicon Valley Bank. In fact, Silicon Valley Bank's CEO had spread $500,000 around Congress, influencing legislators to pass that very legislation, that very deregulation that Donald Trump signed in 2018. And sure enough, 5 years later, that bank failed, along with two others so far, the Signature Bank and the First Republic Bank. Markets are not happy about this. We'll see how it shakes out. Like I said, I'm not particularly freaked out because these are the small and medium-sized banks. The big banks are still regulated. But hopefully, people will figure out the simple bottom line, that greed is not good, and that when you don't regulate greed, you end up with disasters. Now, this case is specific to banking, but there's a whole bunch of other ones. I mean, we've all seen this. It might be selling opioids that kill hundreds of thousands of Americans, or poisoning children's metabolisms with processed plastic packaged forever chemical-laced foods that lead to cancer, obesity, and diabetes, or pushing cigarettes, or opposing wind and solar farms. I mean, there's always somebody willing to sell, some politician willing to sell their soul for the right price, and there's always some billionaire out there who has enough money to pay that price. We've all seen this greed working in real time. My own father was killed knowingly by the asbestos industry because they were not regulated. My brother, who died last year, was killed by the tobacco industry because they were not regulated. And these industries knew exactly what they were doing. And if there's not a similar story in your life, then you're probably the outlier. So what do? This is what happens when the high-functioning sociopaths among us start buying these billionaires and CEOs start buying off legislators because Citizens United, because the Supreme Court legalized it. And this is why billionaires only pay 3% in income taxes. Donald Trump is the poster child for this. We must start regulating these industries. We must change this paradigm, this whole Reagan thing that, government is the problem, government's not the solution. No, government can be the solution. And we need to do something about this. We need to be re-regulating these banks and a few other industries as well. This is not the only deregulation that Donald Trump and his buddies did. There were bunches of them. And you're going to see more consequences of it as well.